I wonder if you could start by introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about what you do in your day job.
Yeah, well, thank you so much first for inviting me, and I'm excited to chat with you. So I am a associate professor of genetic medicine at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. My background is really as a quantitative human geneticist, and I've focused primarily in understanding the genetics of psychiatric diagnoses, neurodiverse traits, and also now that I am running a lab at a center that has a very large biobank and associated electronic health records, I'm working to understand the relationship between mental health diagnoses and some of the chronic complex physical conditions that are often comorbid with those. So really kind of trying to understand the mind-body relationship through the perspective of biology. So I run a lab at Vanderbilt that includes students and staff and young faculty to do that.
Lovely, thank you. And on top of that, you also were, and that still are until a reorganization, chair of the ethics committee at the ISPG.
That's
which is
right.
the International Society for Psychiatric Genetics. And one of the things that ISPG wants to do is improve and increase public engagement in psychiatric genetics. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about why we want to do that and why that's important.
Yeah, and I think that actually community engagement has maybe been a little slow to come to genetics in general, often because much of the research that we're doing involves hundreds of thousands of people, sometimes millions of people. And so it can be a sort of daunting task to think about, how do you engage with, with that sort of sample size when you're thinking about community engagement. But I think that what we're trying to bring to the table is an idea that community engagement goes beyond recruitment or engaging with individuals who are actually participating in your study. It's really about developing a partnership with the broader community of folks who may be touched in one way or another by your research. And there are many reasons for wanting to do that. I think probably first and foremost, for me at least, is the desire to avoid harm. So we have lots of examples throughout, biomedical research, the history of biomedical research, that examples of unintended harmful consequences when people when scientists just didn't really consider the perspective of the folks whose lives their research would touch. And so I think first and foremost we can avoid harm by actually talking with people up front about their thoughts, their concerns, their hopes for research endeavors. The other really important thing is that it's actually very difficult to figure out what the priorities really should be until you actually engage with people who are living them, right? And so community engagement offers us an opportunity to partner with, folks in the community to actually help us set our priorities and to help us along the way figure out how to have this kind of back and forth in a way that is not just about the community informing the research, but also about the research being brought back into the community, so that it's really a true partnership, and one that is going in a direction that people with lived experiences feel is the right direction and a helpful direction. Because in the end, that's why we're doing what we're doing, is because we actually want to improve quality of life for people. So I think, understanding those lived experiences, avoiding harm, and setting priorities are some of the really key reasons for wanting to engage more broadly when it comes to genetics.
And one of the challenges we find in engaging people with genetics is people think it's complicated, and it is, isn't it? I mean, there's no way of getting around it. The vocabulary is challenging, the science is challenging, the ideas are often misunderstood and misrepresented, and there's a lot of baggage that goes with genetics and mental health as well that kind of concerns people and worries people. So in your endeavors to, or in our endeavors to increase public engagement, are there particular things that you found helpful?
Yeah, I think, well, one thing that I think is really, maybe goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway, is that community engagement is really something that requires space and time and devoted energy over a period of time, right? So I think, expecting that you might have one kind of experience with, community members and walk away feeling like, okay, well, my engagement piece is done. I think that's, not the right attitude. There's really, I think, a lot for the investigators to be able to explain in an accessible way. But then there's also a lot for the community members to be able to explain to the investigators in an accessible way. And those things take time and trust and patience, I think, also. And so when it comes to communicating in a community engaged way, I think that we can get around some of these, complex technical issues by just having conversations with people and figuring out what is the language that clicks, right? And it might be different for somebody with one set of lived experiences than it is for somebody with another. And I think that the degree to which genetics is involved in, in our development as human beings is kind of the place to start. So helping people to understand that what they learned in middle school, maybe about, Punnett squares and dominant and recessive genes, is only one part of the picture, but that actually the vast majority of health conditions that we think of as being genetic have a much more complex and varied genetic contribution. And so it just takes some time to figure out how to express those ideas, I think.
And one of the other challenges that we've come across when we talk about public engagement, and also when we talk about biobanks themselves, are issues around diversity and equality. How are we doing on that, and what more work needs to be done around those very particular issues, and why do they matter?
Well, so I think in particular in psychiatric genetics, there is a lot of work still to be done, both from the clinical perspective and from the genetics perspective. And there are multiple reasons for that. So I'll kind of describe a few of those. So from the psychiatric perspective, or at least from the clinical side of things, it's no surprise to anybody, I think, that like the history of psychiatry has been very Eurocentric, and the field itself is still largely white, very male. And so again, when we talk about incorporating those kind of lived experiences, when we have a clinical workforce that is very homogeneous, that is problematic because there's a difficulty in relating to the lived experiences of people who don't share those identities. And I think this plays out in the way that diagnoses are assigned. It plays out in the way that medications are delivered or therapies are delivered. So there's actually a lot of inequality that is currently being reported in the literature about this in relation to race and ethnicity and the delivery of psychiatric healthcare. So that's one part that really is critical to address, for equity in healthcare reasons. But then it also impacts our research as well, because when we don't have representation from diverse communities, we end up really only being able to discover a small slice of the possible realm of discovery. And that is very limiting for everybody. So aside from the kind of ethical problems that are inherent in having reduced representation from populations across the world, it also really has a damaging effect on the science itself.
Yeah, and by damaging effect, there are kind of two aspects to that, aren't there? There's the kind of whole load of stuff that you just miss because it's not there, and then there's the skew if you assume what you have is a representative sample and it's just not.
Exactly.
And you're discovering something that has meaning for a subgroup of the population. You shouldn't infer that has meaning for the whole population.
Exactly.
And broader science has a long, and engineering and pretty much everything we do has quite a long history of doing that, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Whether that's gender, ethnicity, or a whole range of other things. It is something that we just need to constantly be aware of.
Yeah, exactly. I would add though that I think this has been, a problem that has simmered for a very long time, and it's been one that people have been trying to draw attention to for a long time. And I think just in the last couple of years is one that the majority scientific community has recognized as a problem that has to be addressed. And so funders are now putting, funding towards this. There's, I think that the needle is going to shift in the next, 5 years, and we're going to see much more of a concerted effort to engage with broader world populations, to engage with more ethnically and racially diverse patient communities, provider communities, and scientists. And I'm excited about what is going to come.
That's excellent. So that kind of leads us into this is a seminar series about public mental health and the future of public mental health and where it might be. What do you think psychiatric genetics and maybe even broader genetics has to offer and contribute to public mental health, and what do we need to do that well to take full advantage of that?
So this is actually something that I've thought about a lot, because I think that the field of psychiatric genetics and human genetics in general has really focused their attention on precision medicine. And while I think that is there's a lot of potential for tremendous improvement in quality of life through precision medicine, I think that we're actually missing a huge opportunity to really address some larger social and community-based issues around mental health through the perspective or through the lens of understanding genetics. So let me give you kind of an example that I give to my students when I'm teaching about the genetics of of complex traits. So, so imagine that you are an alien and you come to Earth and you meet two humans. You meet Shaquille O'Neal and Simone Biles. So Shaquille O'Neal, over 6 feet tall, huge basketball player. Simone Biles, you know, a petite woman, gymnast. And so you might think, okay, humans come in two forms. They come in very tall or small. And what you would be missing would be the entire distribution of human height that is the continuum between those, right? So that is a kind of thought experiment that I ask my students to engage in, because the point I want to make is that we are still very much alien to ourselves. We are still really figuring out what it means to be human, to have these shared human experiences. And much of our research has actually focused on the extremes of experiences without actually understanding a lot of what is this broad continuum that connects those. And I think when we look at the genetics, this is very clearly what we see, that there are no defined boundaries between individuals who have a diagnosis of, you know, any mental health condition and those who don't. There's not a clear genetic definition for any neuropsychiatric condition, neurodiverse trait, psychiatric diagnosis, that we all have some degree of genetic liability to various mental health diagnoses. We all have some genetic protective factors. And then the experiences that we have throughout life also contribute to, you know, whether we might experience an episode of mental illness. And so I think what we really are lacking is that continuous view of mental health and neurodiversity. And I think that genetics is a lens through which we can better understand that. But we have to start communicating some of the foundational ideas that are kind of inherent in our genetic discoveries.
And I think there's also a little bit of what you described there may be seen as slightly countercultural to people who are used to this idea that genetics explains things. So, you know, we will find the gene for schizophrenia, and that will prove it exists and prove that person A has it and person B doesn't. What you're describing is the exact opposite of that, isn't it? And that kind of, some people will find that strange. A lot of people will find that strange. Do people find that strange?
You know, I think that yes, I think a lot of people are sort of surprised by the fact that in most cases, genetics is not deterministic. And I think that some of the, for example, some of the messaging sometimes around like the direct to consumer genetic tests and those sorts of things, can lead people to think that even if it's complicated, it's still deterministic, right? So for example, 23andMe, you know, their tagline is "Welcome to you," which gives the impression that there's something you're going to learn about your genetics that is going to inform you about who you are in some core way. And I think what's important for people to understand is that their genetics don't determine who they are in a core way. Their genetics contribute, but lots of other things also contribute. And that the kind of Punnett square design of, you know, if you have big A, you definitely, you know, have red feathers. that just doesn't hold up for complex traits, and certainly not for mental health conditions.
And I suppose coming to the end of our discussion, what are the messages that you'd like people to take away? If you've encouraged some of the people engaging in this seminar to spend more time thinking and talking about psychiatric genetics, encouraging the people they work with to get involved in it, what would you like the key messages for them to take away and use as stimuli for these discussions?
Oh, there are so many. Okay. I think one thing really is that I think it is important, and it shifts people's perspectives on mental health and mental illness, and the fuzzy boundaries between them, when we do think about the fact that we all carry some genetic risk for every single mental health diagnosis. We all carry some risk for that. And I think that it's something that I've seen in my own life, that when people really understand that, they are less likely to engage in kind of othering of individuals who may have a diagnosis, and maybe more likely to see what they have in common, right? So I think that is, that's one important thing, is that those boundaries don't exist in nature. Those boundaries are ones that humans impose on ourselves. And I think that another is, when it comes to community engagement, we just have to keep at it. We just have to keep trying to communicate with each other. So if you are, not an expert and not a geneticist, but you want to understand the genetics, and you find yourself in a conversation with a geneticist, keep asking them to explain until you understand it, because it is understandable by anybody. We just have to get past the use of jargon that those of us in the field have become so entrenched in. So I would say, don't be afraid to push somebody to really explain something in a way that is understandable. And I think on the researcher side, I would say don't be afraid to approach people who, maybe have the diagnosis that you are studying in the lab. I think that it's really, really important that we start to open ourselves up, and actually listen to those lived experiences and engage with people in a more meaningful way.